Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ann Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. I am absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to this virtual discussion where we'll be exploring protection challenges in humanitarian logistics. Today's event is jointly organized by PHAP and the Humanitarian Logistics Association, the HLA. I'm joined today by my co-host, George Fenton, the Chief Executive of the Humanitarian Logistics Association. George, it's great to have you on the line, and thanks so much for suggesting that we organize this event together.
Thank you very much, Shanghai. It's great to be here, and thank you too for your support. As Shanghai says, I'm George Fenton. I'm the Chief Executive of the Humanitarian Logistics Association. I've been working in humanitarian assistance for much of my career, and I'm looking forward to this webinar today.
Thanks a lot, George. And from our discussions over the past weeks and months, I've gathered that in your work with the HLA and, of course, throughout your own long humanitarian career, the topic of protection in logistics has kept coming up as something that is insufficiently addressed, and really this need for a forum to explore these issues. Could I ask you, just to get us started with today's webinar, why do you think this is an important topic to discuss right now?
Yeah, thanks, Anhara. I think that we can agree that in recent years, international engagement and activity in the field of humanitarian protection has significantly increased. But has this actually led to enhanced safety, security, and dignity for populations at risk? A key area of risk being that related to humanitarian logistics and the management of aid supply chains. Protection in logistics practice, i.e. the last mile delivery and distribution of aid, must reflect the right capacity and understanding among humanitarian stakeholders, as well as the desire of crisis-affected individuals and communities to engage and be engaged in humanitarian efforts to enhance their protection. The operational frameworks and humanitarian logistics tools for supporting community-based protection really need critical attention and further development. So protection is often conceived as a response to the most visible and serious human rights violations, often perpetrated by states, armed groups, or international actors. But this understanding can detract from the protection of individuals and communities and may fail to recognize and respond to protection problems caused through the distribution of humanitarian aid. The humanitarian logistics community therefore has a duty to better recognize these challenges and take steps to better equip personnel engaged in the sector to recognize and tackle protection as well as safeguarding issues.
Yeah. Thanks so much for really a great start, I think, in framing the discussion and why we're all here today. I see we have more than 100 people on this platform, and I know more are joining via YouTube to participate today. And I, for one, hope that this is just the beginning. I would really like to thank you, George, and also your colleagues in the Humanitarian Logistics Association again for bringing this issue, this question, to our attention and working with us at PHAP to frame this first conversation. So then, to get started with our event, I would like to introduce our panelists. Today we will be joined by 4 speakers. 3 of them are humanitarian logisticians or related professionals who will share their experiences regarding protection issues in the realm of humanitarian logistics, broadly speaking. First of all, Will Holden is the Managing Director of the Emergency Logistics Team and has been in senior logistics positions in crisis situations around the world. Next, Tikhwi Muyundo is with the Castelbarco Capacity Building Consultants. She also serves as the Africa Regional Representative of the Humanitarian Logistics Association and has experience of managing logistics for humanitarian organizations in multiple complex emergencies. Valerie Craigie is a supply chain and communications consultant who will be focusing in particular on her work related to gender-based violence and logistics. And last but not least, we're also very happy to have with us Pierre Gentile, who will be sharing his perspectives on the topic as a protection specialist. Pierre is the former head of the protection division at the ICRC and is currently working independently as a consultant. And now, before turning to our panelists to ask them a few questions, I would like to begin the substantive part of the discussion today by presenting the results of the pre-event survey that many of you filled in. We actually had a terrific response rate with 172 complete responses. So I gather probably nearly everyone who's joining us live in the Adobe platform, and probably many of you who are listening in on YouTube as well. So thanks so much for providing this great input. The survey was designed to look into a series of questions regarding how frequently practitioners have observed different protection issues related to logistics, and provide examples on this from their own experience, as well as look into questions regarding the availability of guidance for logisticians in this area. And based on the results, it appears that most of you have experienced or witnessed issues related to protection in humanitarian logistics. So that was about 60% who said you had witnessed such issues. However, a significant portion had not, and we'd like to dig a bit deeper into this question to look at whether this was a result of not being in a position to observe these issues, or whether you believe that there are not major protection issues related to logistics activity, or if you're simply not sure. So if you have a moment now as you're listening, please do fill in that follow-up question so we can dig a bit deeper there. But now let's look at some of the types of issues that we were asking about in the survey. All of them did seem to resonate with you as respondents. The most common, according to the responses, seem to be issues related to logisticians facing protection concerns among affected people that they had not been prepared to handle. More than 90% have observed this phenomenon, and more than 80% have observed it more than once. So this really was at the top of the list, and I know that we'll be hearing in the coming hour more about this from our panelists. Also, issues related directly to how protection is carried out in procurement, recruitment, transport, and storage have also been observed frequently, although somewhat less so. Finally, sexual exploitation and abuse, not as commonly witnessed, but still more than 50% reporting having witnessed at least once, so this is still very much a concern. So, first of all, looking a bit more deeply at this question of lack of capacity to deal or preparation to deal with protection issues encountered on the ground, we did have a couple of examples. One participant wrote in from who's working in the United States now about issues related to distributors of milk and meals to vulnerable populations not being trained in potential protection issues that they might face and how to handle those. Someone also writing in who's based in Germany, who's observed a problem of lack of training or awareness among logistics personnel related to humanitarian principles, and that lack of awareness of principles itself creating threats for people at risk instead of serving as a source of protection. Then, regarding procurement specifically, there were a number of examples coming in related to corruption leading to protection issues, as well as demands for sourcing goods and services from different communities, leading also to protection concerns. Some examples coming from South Sudan by an individual working in logistics in South Sudan related to kickbacks and these compromising service delivery, and ultimately compromising service delivery on the grounds of quality of commodities and products reaching the final end user. Another example coming from Somalia, related to logisticians in some cases, or those working with logisticians making contracts with gatekeepers and thereby having a share of goods going to unintended end recipients following distribution. Looking at the issue of transport and storage, most examples that we had coming in through the survey related to this area were concerned specifically with tensions and violence breaking out over insufficient supplies and recipients being at risk of robbery or other violations following distributions. We had a colleague writing in from Australia who had personally witnessed multiple protection issues, robberies by armed gangs and by other members of the community who were not recipients of distributions. And another colleague writing in with examples of militia attacks directly on distribution centers. So very much a concern there. And then finally, regarding recruitments, there were some concerns here coming through regarding, for example, child labor, poor staff recruitment and management processes, and particularly pointing to concerns regarding subcontracted service providers. There were some concerns about SEA as well, and while fewer people had reported witnessing it themselves, this is probably not surprising due to the nature of the abuse. However, there were a few anecdotes, first-person accounts that came in through the survey. We'll be consolidating those into the report. And an important thing I did want to bring up, although it was not covered among the options that we examined in the pre-event survey, something that really came through in the open response inputs on the survey was this concern regarding protection risks and safety risks for logistics staff themselves. So this is clearly an area of concern and something that I think we would hope to host a separate session on in the near future. This concern about staff security and protection even of the logistics community and contractors themselves, and how that relates to protection of affected populations. And then finally, when it comes to the question of guidance for logisticians to deal with protection concerns, many of you thought that there was a lack of guidance in the first place. However, half of respondents pointed out that existing guidance was not being sufficiently implemented, so a gap at that level as well. And still a majority thought that existing guidance needed to be tailored to better apply to logistics. So we see, at least based on this very quick snapshot of the issue, really concerns on all three levels: the existence of guidance, its implementation, and the degree to which it's tailored to more effectively speak to the logistics community. So thanks again for all of these inputs. Once again, we'll be consolidating these and sending those consolidated reports in the follow-up to this event, but a very good way to get us started with the discussion. So following that input from all of you, I'd now like to turn to our panelists. And first of all, over to Will. So once again, Will Holden, Managing Director, Emergency Logistics Team. A question to you to get us rolling. Humanitarian logistics is often seen as more or less a separate service and a support service to humanitarian programming, dealing not directly with beneficiaries, but as a support somehow separated from that direct interaction with affected people. And we have heard it said that as a consequence, protection concerns may be simply less of an issue for the logistics community. As a logistician yourself, is this separation something that you see in practice, or in your view, are things more integrated actually on the ground? Over to you, Will.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. From my point of view, I've been involved in the humanitarian sector for about 7 or 8 years now. And I would say, I have to be honest, that there's been a massive sea change in relation to the interaction between the programs and the support functions, the supply chain logistics functions. but there's a huge amount of work still to be done. I see it on a daily basis back here in Iraq. There's just many different organizations who are planning their programs and their budgeting even, and very little interaction with the support function. And that just leaves huge gaps, especially in relation to protection concerns. And this is something I could see very clearly a few years ago when I got involved in this area.
Great. And could you elaborate a bit? What kinds of implications for protection do you see this raising with the sea change that you point out?
So some of the responses you mentioned from the polls were interesting because you sort of touched on a few things, whether it's procurement, whether it's warehousing and distribution, so even planning distributions, for example. And you have to plan them in a coordinated way so that I suppose the most vulnerable are taken care of, women and children are taken care of, and it's just really it's an overall view. So if you're working in the commercial world, for example, you wouldn't call protection issues per se, but you have various different duty of care for your own staff or for the people you're delivering goods to, and it's just bringing that same mentality into the humanitarian sector. So it's an integrated approach between the procurement, warehousing, distribution, and the programs. And should be working hand in glove to make sure that everything is covered.
Yeah, absolutely. As we saw from the survey results, there were a number of people who also expressed a concern regarding a lack of training, a lack of preparedness for logisticians to handle the kinds of the situations that they find themselves in. In your experience, are the logisticians who do find themselves really on the front line, being in many cases, as you've told us before, the first people to encounter populations in need and in crisis situations, are they well equipped to handle protection concerns, and where do you see the biggest gaps when it comes to preparedness?
So I think some of the biggest gaps I've seen a few times are around emergencies, really. So periods like Iraq is transitioning into a development phase, which is fantastic. So there should be more time and effort put into training the logistics staff so that it's prepared and at least have a basic understanding of protection and what it means in their field. Again, most people will move from commercial business into humanitarian and back again. And it's really just so they have an understanding of the implications of what they do on a daily basis, because everything you do affects everybody around you. And that's, in relation to the training, again, you see it in the emergency specifically where things happen quickly, whether it's a natural disaster or a conflict. Will people get trained to be able to say, with women, maybe you don't interact quite much, or children, especially not in a logistics environment. You rarely be dealing with children on a daily basis, or the elderly or the most vulnerable. So again, a basic training and retraining, and to be part of, I encourage wherever I go, encourage the protection team members to give brief presentations and updates so everybody is part of the same team. It's a team building exercise, it should be.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think very good suggestions as well. Much appreciated. We're going to turn to Tikhwi now. Tikhwi Muyundo with Castelbarco Capacity Building Consultants and also Africa Regional Representative for the Humanitarian Logistics Association. Tikhwi, you have been working in humanitarian logistics in several different conflict situations, including in Sudan, Somalia, and Afghanistan. Looking more at how logistics is carried out in these situations, how goods are procured, stored, delivered, distributed, are there any particular issues that you have come across in your work that seem to raise protection concerns?
Thank you very much, Angad. Yes, definitely. And maybe just to give some context to the issues, we acknowledge and recognize that a disaster is not a normal situation. and therefore any operational occurrence during the emergencies are unpredictable and sometimes difficult to prevent or immediately resolve. But having said that, organizations do have mechanisms in place that can identify preventable incidents and situations that could otherwise lead to violence and protection issues. But like the previous panelists mentioned, the humanitarian logisticians are usually the first on the ground. They're amongst the first responders, and therefore they sort of bear the brunt of the emergency and face the situation. Looking at the protection issues, the very common protection issues related first of all to procurement, we hire contractors, mainly transporters, and sometimes these people actually do harm to the beneficiaries. Look at the distribution centers. Poor management of distribution centers can result in violence. If not properly managed, you'll find in some areas people favoring communities that they come from because you will use local distribution staff. Or sometimes distribution centers are far away and you find that the sick, the old women, and the young children, have to walk long distances to access supplies. Women and children are exposed to, and from distribution centers, and therefore, can be exposed to violence. There are inappropriate donations all the time in emergency situations that the logisticians have to handle, they have to manage, they have to deal with. Poor commodity management at all levels could result in expired products finding their way to the distribution centers and into the hands of communities. Lack of cultural sensitivity amongst the first responders could cause tensions within the community. A good example is just shaking hands with women in some communities. If you're not familiar with some of these cultural sensitivities, it can cause problems within the community. Poor commodity specifications can cause delays in the provision of aid, thus putting communities at greater risk. Staff misconduct, the staff that we hire, we need to train the staff as the staff are hired, but sometimes you cannot cover all the bases, and some staff can cause harm to beneficiaries within the communities that they're working in. Deploying staff who are not qualified or trained, you'll find that their performance could easily put communities at risk. Now, a good example is within the communication sector, where taking pictures can actually cause a problem and have happened in some contexts within the Afghanistan response. Poor pipeline management. If the pipeline of commodities is not properly managed, you'll find that there are constant stockouts. Now, the result of this is that you will find within the distribution centers, you will not have sufficient commodities to distribute. In that event, you'll find the communities become restless and sometimes it causes violence. There's a lot of issues that occur within the humanitarian response, and some of these can and some of them cannot be addressed immediately on the ground because some of them are not predictable.
Very interesting and a really, really helpful list of issues, and I think great material for further follow-up even after today. I would like to follow up with you on one of the types of issues that you mentioned. You did go through a whole range, but one area you mentioned had not come up in the pre-event survey, but I do think it's a really interesting one to dig into further. You mentioned inappropriate donations. Do you have any specific examples of this from your experience that come to mind that you could share with us?
Yes. One that did cause a major problem was during food distribution, where you have donations that come in. Sometimes these are unsolicited donations because within the humanitarian sector, to receive a donation, you must have the donation approved. But when they're unsolicited and land on the ground and the humanitarian logistician receives it, and you find, for example, there is pork in an environment where pork is not accepted. Now that causes a problem because it is difficult to hide a product like that. It causes tension within the community. It causes tension between the authorities and the organization that is doing the distribution. But the resentment can again cause problems on the ground in terms of, violence. You find demonstration, rioting, because they're protesting your lack of sensitivity.
Very interesting, and another great example, I think, of how members of the logistics community can be confronted with a practical issue on the ground that really has serious protection implications. So thank you, Tikhwi. Now turning to Valerie, Valerie Craigie, Supply Chain and Communications Consultant. Valerie, I'd like to turn to you specifically regarding the issue of protection and gender-based violence. I know you've been working on this, which, based on the questions that registrants have sent in for this event and also many of the responses to the survey, we can see that this issue is very much on the front of people's minds when logistics and protection come up as a topic. So Valerie, you've had the opportunity to engage on this issue with logistics colleagues. Could you tell us a bit about how the logisticians you have interviewed see this issue, this topic of gender-based violence?
Yes, of course. Many thanks, Amra. The logisticians that I interviewed worked in Liberia, Lebanon, Sudan and Greece in site planning. They all felt that there was a complete disengagement between the different clusters and a lack of communication. All said that they didn't speak with the community leaders from the camp until after the camp was built and believed if they had done so they would have planned quite differently. At no point did the site planners speak with those in protection before planning. Everything was based on numbers and checklists, but there were key areas lacking. For example, the locks and latrines, lighting, security, and the distance, as was previously mentioned, distance of the camps from local markets and firewood, which would obviously cause the women and children to be more vulnerable. Research shows that there are clear divisions between clusters, and although guidelines emphasise the importance of communication, multi-sectoral approach, shared learnings, it's just not happening enough. All humanitarians can play a role in keeping women and children safe urban site planning and build camps that they can grow and thrive in rather than just function. We need to consider how you can help provide a safe environment to protect those that live there. Remember that if the rights and needs of women and other at-risk groups are not addressed during site planning, these persons may be placed in isolated or unprotected areas, exposing them to sexual harassment and violence. Many think that protection is not my area and leave it entirely to the protection experts, but you may be surprised. Site planners and logisticians can dramatically improve the environment and the living conditions to provide safety and protection from threats within the camp. The sustainable and integration phases of a camp is an important phase to keep in mind because it underlines the importance of thinking holistically about a camp even when it is first being constructed. Ultimately, camps will no longer exist for one reason or another, and camp managers, aid organisations and local governments can benefit from having a plan for how to repurpose the camp for surrounding communities. An urban planner, Anaset Adisa, worked with the UNHCR to radically change the layout of living spaces in the Dalo Ado camp in Ethiopia. He began a small pilot project and met with refugees to discuss their needs and identify solutions that were best suited to their lifestyles. He realised that the camp's housing grid structure meant there were no functioning community spaces, inhibiting social interaction. He set about a solution and provided a new area of the camp where houses were arranged in a U-shape instead, allowing families to live in communities that closer resemble their villages back home, and created space for a community garden in the middle. This facilitated interactions between families and also enhanced security by removing the houses off the main streets, and the people could have enough space for a small garden in each compound. Speaking with a planner in Greece, she said many mistakes were made when initially putting up shelters and creating spaces for those who came in their droves. She said we need to listen and involve the community as to what their concerns are. Having spoken to the people who were moving into the camps, they now keep trees wherever possible for shade, fruit and a reminder of home. In addition, they left areas for safe spaces. These spaces are an integral part of functioning life and are used for children to play, adults to train, learn, socialise, and create segregated spaces so women can have privacy for breastfeeding, counselling, workshops, etc. She said we didn't understand the importance of local engagement, but now we work more with local communities. It builds trust and opens relationships with both men and women and the practitioners. We have found that small differences can make a large impact on the people living there. I hope I've answered this question. Logisticians are now realising that there is no quick solution. Consideration needs to be given to those living there and a process put in place as to how best to meet their needs. We can all play a small part in such an immense problem, and in doing so, we can improve the situation.
Thank you very much, Valerie. Certainly really helpfully answered the question, and thank you so much for sharing with us the valuable insights that you've gathered through your research, and I hope that you'll find a way to continue that as well, because it does seem that there is much to be done and much to learn each from the other. So now I'd like to turn to Pierre. Pierre Gentile is now an independent consultant. He was until recently the head of the Protection Division at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. So Pierre, you have worked in coordinating roles related to protection, both in the field in many locations and in Geneva. As you've been listening to the myriad issues raised by our logistics colleagues throughout the last 30 minutes, how do these issues that they've raised relate to the overall humanitarian protection concerns that you see in the sector? Over to you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. Indeed, they resonate. And I think you can put them into three categories. And this is a little bit the same discussion that happened within the protection community. The first category of issues I heard are somehow linked to the code of conduct of the different organization and the behavior of its own members. The second one is linked more to the notion of do no harm. How do you make sure that the way you are setting up your operation is not contributing to exacerbate existing tension or discrimination? And how are you aware of those existing tension so as to be able to actually make sure that your programming is not exacerbating them? The third one is about trends of abuse and violation that are there and that you are coming across, that you are witnessing. What can you do about it? And I think here we didn't discuss about it, but it's about what belongs to the capacity to refer when you are witnessing something, to who should you refer it and how should you refer it, and if there are things that you can directly address, that you can directly try to curb to make sure that there is less of those abuses happening. So I think this type of distinction are exactly the same that you would find in all protection discussion. What is it that belongs to the code of conduct? What is it that belongs to do no harm, or the way we work to make sure that we don't exacerbate existing tension? And finally, the abuses around us that we have to make sure that we can redirect to the one who are able to address, and sometimes address directly ourselves.
Excellent, very helpful, and thank you for bringing up the capacity to refer. I think an essential points, particularly as the discussion moves ahead. I wanted to ask you as well, Pierre, as I know you have been working on standards for protection work. What are you aware of when it comes to guidance specifically related to the logistics community, guidance for protection concerns related to logistics work? Are you aware of efforts in this area or guidance that exists but perhaps could be adapted? What's the state of things there?
My reflection on that would be that if we are speaking about the dimension of do no harm, here the sphere principle, especially the overarching principle on protection, would be the one to refer to. I think they give a very good understanding of what are today the things that anyone should be aware of when trying precisely not to exacerbate his existing tension and discrimination. And I think this applies perfectly well from what I heard from the different presenters before. So there the sphere probably already would give quite a lot of indication. For the dimension of more individual cases that you may come across of people who have been victim or are at risk of becoming victim of abuses, here, if you speak of the referral, I think the professional standards for protection work do have a few standards on the referral. And probably linking with the local protection cluster and discussing with them, setting up a clear referral mechanism with them would be very, very useful.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And continuing on this thread related to guidance, Valerie, could I come back to you as you were speaking specifically about gender-based violence? What has your been experience regarding the available guidance in this area that's available to the logistics community? Over to you, Valerie.
There are actually quite a number of guidelines available. Just read, like there's lots online. There's the IASC guidelines, UNFPA guidelines, Global Protection Cluster. They're all out there, but all of which aim to assist humanitarian actors to make their current programs more effective. But more often there are specialised GBV programs not integrated into other humanitarian programs, health, education, logistics. And this proves ineffective as programs start and stop quickly and do not meet the broad needs of sexual violence survivors. Many camps have been designed without the consideration of the refugees themselves, and this needs to change as the camp must be able to adapt. The guidelines give many good pieces of information, but I think the problem lies that they're so text heavy that due to time constraints and resources and turnover of staff, it's very hard for people to sit down and go through them all. But some of the nuggets in it is in the guidelines are the multi-sectoral approach, which was mentioned earlier. Working with other clusters, listening to community leaders and local experts, both male and female, is essential, as responding to violence against women and children requires an array of services to ensure that survivors can fully heal and recover. It is the cornerstone of the humanitarian response to GBV and the forum to bring the guidelines to life. It is essential that there's equal engagement of women and men in the decision-making process of camp planning, and the community-based approaches enable survivors to participate in reintegration programs. A bottom-up approach is an effective protection programming approach, and one that gives room for further research within the protection guidelines. There are many areas we can focus on, and perhaps we will in another discussion, but just before I finish answering this, I'd like to quickly touch on culture and context. All guidelines specify we need to be sensitive to local socio-cultural norms. The lack of sensitivity is, however, a huge problem. Locally relevant frameworks for intervention must be considered, as there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It is clearly a challenge for international organisations and local leaders to work together. However, this bottom-up approach is what is needed to ensure the safety, dignity and security of all.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. And I would like to now go back to you, if I could, Pierre, to follow up a bit further than on this question of guidance. And as you have been listening to the logisticians reflecting on some of the practical problems that they have witnessed, would you say, when it comes to generic guidance related to protection, is there anything special about the field of logistics? Let's see, any way in which, say, the logistics community might be different from, say, other clusters or other components of the humanitarian community when it comes to the necessity, the ability to apply, say, the sphere standards, or to apply other generic guidance related to protection?
Thank you. If you allow me, I would reply in two parts. The first one is, yes, there is some specificity, definitively. The fact that in many cases logistics is in itself a network of partners, implementing partners, people that are contracted, subcontracted, hence bringing in some complexity in terms of responsibilities. And especially if you go to the dimension of the do no harm, making sure that this analysis is being really done. This being said, I think that when you go down to the principle on what to do, what to look for, there I don't see a specificity of a logistician versus someone working in different domain in the humanitarian field. And if I could advocate for one thing, it is not for logisticians to start to have their own protection strategies to address different issues, but rather to make sure that they integrate a discussion around protection that exists in most cases. into which possibly they are not yet totally integrated and that they need to link with. What we don't need is on a given thematic, whatever it is, forced displacement, forced recruitment, enforced disappearance, gender-based violence, to have 20 different strategy per organization, one on communication, one on humanitarian diplomacy, one on logistics, one, etc., etc., etc. You need to have one global strategy that addresses the phenomena which takes into account the different dimension and what different actors can bring, into which logistician might or might not, depending which issues we are talking about, have a role to play. So I would really advocate for bridging towards protection actors, being in your own organization, if you are working in an organization where you have a protection department, or within the sector, the global protection sector and the protection cluster in country, to make sure that here there could be a discussion on the different contribution and integration of the logistician into existing strategies. And last but not least, I think for that, what is important is to have an understanding in the context you work on what are the main trends of risks and abuses that the community and individual are faced with. Rather to start with, we are going to work on that and that because there exists guidance. So certainly gender-based violence will come out very frequently, but it shouldn't be kind of a starting point to say, okay, we need to have these two domains covered, but rather to have this understanding of what are the key issues. It might be in one case it's about forced disappearance. In other case it's about question linked to child protection issues. In a third case it may be actually discrimination against older people, etc., etc. You might have different configuration. And here these analyses are usually being done, and you can contribute to it. So rather than redoing it, it's contributing to those analyses and then integrating what are the key areas of concern that you may be faced with. And for this different key area of concern, make sure that you know who you could address the case you might come across. There might not be the same organization. So depending the type of case you come across, to make sure you know who to refer to. But for that, once again, you have to have this understanding of what are these key areas of concern that in the community you work with, people are confronted with, who is working on them, and how you can then contribute to address them or to refer the case you come across.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pierre. Will, I would like to turn to you next. We had an interesting question coming in from Sajid, who's based in Pakistan. It has a logistics coordination role across the region in Asia. Sajid writes, do we want logistics to be aware of the protection issues so that we in the logistics community can consider those in our planning? Or is logistics actually responsible for some protection measures? If yes, how? And what would those activities be? Over to you, Will.
Nice, simple question. Thank you very much. Logistics, as I said earlier, should be working hand in glove. So we're talking about planning first. So I'll give an example. 5 years ago, it's a timely example, about this time 5 years ago, ISIS attacked in Iraq and caused mayhem. Hundreds of thousands of people were moving from one area to the other, leaving Mosul and various areas of Nineveh and elsewhere in Iraq. So en masse and overnight, literally, people arrived in Kurdistan or in Baghdad or various other centers in the country. The first people who reached with emergency food rations and water was the distribution teams and I managed one of those teams out of many that was here at the time. We had a very general conversation. It all happened so quick that we didn't have time to really give anybody proper training in protection standards. It just hadn't happened at that stage. But we did have a general conversation in relation to how to deal with women and the children. And a lot of the people who were turning up, they were literally shell-shocked after the horrific things they've seen and endured. So we could have and did have a very immediate impact, not just distributing the food and water, but trying to put them at rest and to let them know that they're relatively safe. and that the worst is behind them, inshallah. So that's the planning stage. So we can give some basic planning. And what was the other element of the question?
Yes, the other aspect was to what extent are members of the logistics community, humanitarian logistics community, actually responsible for certain protection measures versus simply needing to be aware of protection issues so that they can consider them in their planning. And if there is that aspect of responsibility, what does that look like? What would be the scope?
Yeah, and in fairness, Pierre hit on this. He made an excellent point, and it ties into pretty much what I was just saying moments ago about referral system. So the supply chain logistics function is a support function for sure. We are not going to be protection experts, but we do need to understand what and who are the protection experts. And again, Pierre mentioned something which reminded me of 5 years ago, that you may not have the experts within your own organization, and especially in emergencies, but you should be able to reach out to those who are. So in my instance, to be honest, when this happened, we had a couple of very severely injured people and people who needed psychosocial support. And I knew somebody in Handicap International here at the time who was a fantastic support. And this was the point about all the different agencies who were here at the time working together. So you don't have to be an expert in the field. You just have to have access to the experts and understand to refer them as quickly as possible.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And yes, great link to Pierre's points there. Now, let's see. We are starting to run short on time, but Tikhwi, I'd like to come back to you. You had mentioned a range of issues related to how logistics is carried out. What would you say are some of the good practices, of the potential solutions that you either see in practice or you would suggest become a greater area of focus?
Sorry, as the other speakers have mentioned, I think it's very important for the logisticians to understand the policies of the organizations that they work in. An example is in the procurement area, where you must vet your suppliers and you must educate the suppliers on those policies and the consequences of them contravening any clauses within those contracts, so that they're also fully aware of what they can and cannot do when they are sent out to the field. And I think one of the speakers also mentioned earlier regarding training the logisticians in terms of an integrated approach with the programs, so that as programs are being trained to manage distribution centers, the staff are also trained, the logistics staff are also trained, and involve community leaders in the distribution planning and management, because then it means the communities are on board and have closer collaboration with security officers, so that you avoid situations that could possibly arise within distribution centers. If the stocks run out, how do we manage the situation, so that the logisticians are also trained? And then also helping them to understand the local context. And these needs to, especially when you've got donations, do we understand the local context? Do we understand the needs? Do we understand how to handle the situation? There isn't a single issue that occurs now that has not occurred before. And therefore the solutions are there, and the ways of mitigating some of these issues are also clearly defined during those times. Then we also need to draw from lessons learned in the past, from our own organizations, from other organizations, so that we identify these issues long before they happen, because they are potential risks. Have a continuous training for our staff on cultural sensitivity. And I believe that as staff are hired within the humanitarian sector, there is a lot of emphasis on cultural sensitivity. And I believe that most organizations do train their staff before they are deployed. So it's important to ensure that we maintain this practice, so that staff are also not put at risk, and therefore also putting communities at risk. And through the procurement department as well, ensuring that commodities are properly standardized, so that we have the same products, we have common standards, and so we're not creating issues in the field that can then also create, problems within the communities. I like the reference previously to the code of conduct. I believe that at the hiring stage for every organization, staff, especially in the humanitarian sector, have to understand the code of conduct, They must understand the relevant policies and also must know how situations are handled and how misconduct is firmly addressed. And that enables them also to be able to practice it and also ensure that that is enforced in the field. Now, ensuring the staff are properly trained and sensitized to all this relating to protection as well. We do have, I think, protection policies in most organizations, and especially on child protection. I think this is something that is dealt with between the humanitarian sector programs, and the protection aspects are really, really emphasized through the support functions, because the support functions are exposed to the beneficiaries in the field. And then in order to avoid stockouts, we adhere to the SEER standards. Before we respond to an emergency, needs assessments are done. We know what we need to go with into the field. And therefore, ensuring that we are adhering to this standard will also protect our organizations from making similar mistakes. So improved pipeline management and working with community leaders also to sensitize them as they work with the communities.
Great. Thank you so much, Tikhwi. I think a great series of suggestions and examples of what I know is already good practice in many organizations. I would like to turn now to George. George, if I could ask, in your role and your experience with the Humanitarian Logistics Association, and now having listened to the reflections of the past hour, what stood out to you from the discussion today? Where do you see this conversation headed? Over to you, George.
Yeah, thanks, Harald. It's great listening to all of the speakers, and I suppose the key points that have come out for me really are that while there is a lot of guidance available, it's not necessarily being applied and understood by the logistics community of practice, and so that's one point that we need to pay attention to in finding ways in which we can better disseminate the code of conduct, the guidance on protection, and make sure that that's applied. I think the other point was that around understanding how to refer abuses to the relevant authorities or other leaders in a given context. So there again, I guess that sort of applies to a better understanding the role of personnel in different situations with regard to managing the logistics supply chain more effectively. Good point around making sure that there's a good understanding among logisticians as to the local context in which they're working and how to engage effectively with community leaders to ensure that there's good interaction when logistics interventions are being undertaken. And I think obviously it's really key that protection is seen as the responsibility of the personnel themselves and not seen as just the responsibility of somebody else. So those are some of the things that I reflected on.
Great. Thanks a lot, George, and yeah, thanks again to the HLA for raising this issue, and I do look forward to future collaboration between PHAP and the humanitarian logistics community on other related topics as well. Now, as we wrap up, I would like to go around our virtual table here to give the floor to each one of our guest speakers again for very brief concluding remarks. I'll go first to you, Valerie, then to Pierre, then to Tikhwi, and finally to Will. So Valerie, over to you. What are your brief reflections on the hour and something you'd like to leave with the participants today?
Okay, well, firstly, I was so happy to see so many people logged on to this webinar. When Tikhwi spoke, Many of the things resonated with me because she's been seeing much practice on the ground, and from the research that I did with logistics across the world, we both kind of came from the same, we both sung the same song. So if we could come away from this and just remember that protection is not just for protection experts, that it is for everybody to play their part, and that some simple things that we have discussed, all of us have touched on throughout this webinar, can really make a huge difference. But I think maybe the most important one is the context and culture and engaging with the local community, so a bottom-up approach is essential. And if we can bear that in mind for the next moving forward, that will be a huge benefit to the people that are living in these horrible situations.
Thank you very much, Valerie, and thanks for sharing with us today. And to you, Pierre, your closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with us.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I do think that logisticians have a role to play in protection, as any humanitarian worker has. As I mentioned, when you came across a case, please do know who to refer them to and how to refer them to, not to put these people at further risk in the referral process, but it's important to know what to do. Also to contribute analysis, and then maybe one specific element. I think when you look at the programming you're in charge of, to have a specific look at who actually doesn't receive what they should receive. Who are the people who are left behind? Is it for a question of difficulty of access? Is it for a lack of information on their part on the rights and the service they could access? Is it because there is active discrimination? Is it out of fear? So the understanding of who actually has not got what they should have gotten might point to some protection issue. Might or might not. But this analysis, I think you are well placed to do it and to then contribute to this larger understanding of the protection need in the context you are working on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now to Tikhwi, could I give you the floor, please, for your brief closing thoughts today?
Thank you. For years, the logistics function was a back office. And I think over the last decade, this has changed. They're now on the front line. However, when we took them out of the back office and put them on the front line, we didn't, or we have not sufficiently equipped them. And so I think this is an excellent platform. I'm really happy that we're discussing this, that we're talking about this, to understand that we need to sufficiently equip the logisticians for them to perform effectively, for us to enable the program to deliver their objectives. The logistics function plays a key role. And I think protection is central to everything that we do in the field. So I'm glad that this discussion is happening. I'm really happy to have seen so many on board, that these numbers can now go out there and multiply to more logisticians so that we can create more awareness on the need to train logisticians, to relook at the way we function so that there is a more integrated approach, so that the logistics function is brought much closer and enabled.
Excellent. Thank you, Tikhwi. Thanks so much for joining the discussion today. Last but not least, Will, I'd like to give you the floor for your closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'd just like to echo what people have said. It's fantastic, I think, to see so many people signing in for this event. The only advice I'd ever give really is to all the staff I've ever worked and trained is be aware of your surroundings. Look above what you're doing just in front of you and look around. And if you see any, what you may call possible protection issues, record them. Let people know, let your superiors know. And for the protection actors out there, I would just ask them to reach out to their logistics and supply chain teams and get to know them a bit more, and make sure that, or at least try to improve and educate them, because I think you'd be surprised how many people are much more interested in getting involved and understanding this area much better.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to all of our panelists for their great contributions today. Before I leave you all, I would like to share a question that did come through just now from James, who's been listening for the past hour, and I'd like to just offer this as a question for reflection for all of us as we end this hour. James writes, how can we make the teams understand that a limping logistics system will make everything limp in an organization, leading in itself to serious systemic protection issues? Thank you, James. A very interesting question to tie everything together and to reflect on as we part ways today. So with that, thanks again. There's a lot more to discuss, clearly, and we hope to be able to continue this collaboration and partnership with further webinars and other activities with the Humanitarian Logistics Association and others. I'd like to inform all of you that the recording of today's events, as well as resources that have been mentioned, the guidance documents and other resources, will be available within the next few days on the event webpage on the PHAP website. We will also send out a follow-up email. I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining, and those of you who are listening in through YouTube as well as once again our speakers for their valuable contributions, and also to my co-host George. Over to you one more time, George, before we close.
So no, just a final thank you from me too, and as my colleagues have said, it's so great that there's been so much interest in this conversation. I think that it would be important for us to find a way to take forward some of the points that we have raised and to provide some follow-up because this is such a critical area, and I think hopefully we've started a new chapter in this conversation around protection in humanitarian logistics. So thank you all again.
Thanks a lot, George. So with that, I'll sign off and entreat all of you to please fill out the survey that will appear when we close the event. This will help us to learn and continue to grow and to plan great new events in the future. So thanks once again, and we look forward to welcoming you all in a future webinar discussion. It's Herod Lang and the team from PHAP signing off from Geneva.